So the article I selected for this annotation exercise is Social Tolerance and Racist Materials in Public Libraries. I do address why I selected this article and what aspect of the course led me to it in the blog post below, but in this video I'm just going to focus on the article itself. It was published in the Reference and User Services Quarterly, which is the official peer-reviewed journal of the Reference and User Services Association, a division of the American Library Association. The article can be found in Volume 49, Issue 4, which came out in summer 2010, and the author is Susan K. Burke, who, according to this little blurb down here, is an assistant professor at the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Oklahoma. So like Professor Hobbs, the first thing I do with any scholarly article is read the abstract, since this gives me my first clue as to what the article is about. This particular abstract, as you can see, is very brief. In short, Burke is examining public opinion towards the removal of racist books from public libraries, and she does so by analyzing people's responses to a survey given by the General Social Survey from 1976 to 2006. Okay, so now that we've looked at the abstract, I'm going to jump to the graphs that Burke includes. Stay with me now. The first graph shows how support for removing a racist book has changed by year. As you can see, there's not really a definitive pattern it looks like. I do want to take a moment right now to note an interesting choice by Burke to use the term racist book, as in belonging to a racist, instead of racist book. I think that the apostrophe S here is very odd. Usually when we talk about censorship, we talk about it in terms of the material contained in the book and not in terms of the author. You usually don't say a homophobic book, you say a book that contains elements of homophobia. So I'm not really sure why she uses this. Based on the question posed in the survey, which we will return to later, there doesn't really seem to be an indication that that has influenced her decision. So a part of me wonders if it's just a typo, but it occurs too frequently for that. So anyways, that was just a question I had and something I found a little peculiar. So let's move on to the second figure, which shows support for removing a racist book by race, education level, and year. As we can see almost immediately is that with more education, the number of respondents who say that they would remove the book goes down. There's not really a huge decrease over time. There is a little bit of a difference, though, between African American respondents and white respondents. White respondents, are more likely to say don't remove the book than African American respondents. Okay, figure 3 shows support for removing a racist book by race, religious affiliation, and year. As you can see, it appears as though Baptists and Methodists are the most likely to want to remove the racist book, as opposed to Catholics and no religions. And that, once again, it holds steady for over a year, but it does show that whites are less likely to want to remove the book than African Americans, even when religion is taken into account. And this, I believe this is the last graph. Yes, this is the last graph. Sorry, hold on, this froze. Okay, so this is the last graph, and this shows support for removing a racist book by occupation. As we kind of could guess, librarians are the lowest, most likely because they work so closely with the books and because freedom of speech and intellectual freedom are such high ideals within the library profession. Closest to that is college teachers, and I think that this does reflect that people with a college or graduate education are less likely to want to remove the books. And then we can see that, interestingly, teachers K through 12 are higher, and Burke does talk a little bit about the fact that racist materials and inappropriate materials end up being more of a concern when they are for children or offered to children, and I'm sure that teachers K through 12 have to deal with that. Okay, so now that we've examined the graphs, I'm going to go back and go through the article in more depth, trying to summarize it and reflect on my own thoughts and feelings and annotations. Normally I would skim the sections first, but since we are under a bit of a time crunch, I'm going to skip that and instead dive right into the meat of it. You'll see throughout it that I have highlighted or written notes in certain areas. Generally, I highlight major ideas, and then I write notes on things that I personally found interesting or I had an opinion about or a question. And that's usually how I differentiate that in my own work. In this, I tended to also highlight where I had the note just so it was easy for me to find it later. So there's a little bit more highlighting here than I might have otherwise done. So first she gives us our introduction, and then she goes into a literature review of the literature within the library and information studies, talking about intellectual freedom, racism in books. And while she notes the centrality of intellectual freedom to the mission of libraries, she does note that some librarians have felt that librarians should exert more control over what people read than maybe is advocated in the ALA Code of Ethics. For instance, she has Shira 1967 quote saying that librarians not only have the right but also the obligation to keep books out of the hands of people whom they think might be injured by the book. And I found this a very interesting perspective to hear, especially today when intellectual freedom is such a central value in library sciences. And I think that it does raise some concerns that some experts would advocate for such a thing, since it expresses to me a belief that a librarian knows better than the rest of the public about what people should or should not be exposed to. And I don't personally believe that anyone should have power over the knowledge of others, as Emily Knox calls censorship in her article. So anyways, I wrote a little note about that there. Moving along, she talks about how intellectual freedom and access to information in terms of children has been a much more controversial issue, since we tend to believe that children need to be protected more, that they're not quite as able to differentiate between different ideas, and that adults, legally, politically, socially, always have more power than children. But she does note that a lot of people do believe that exposure to controversial ideas will teach children to be critical thinkers, to recognize when they're reading something racist or homophobic, etc. And this takes us into racism in library books, and most of the literature on racism in library books has concerned images or depictions in children's literature, and I think this is one of the limitations of this literature review, that there is not a lot written in the library and information sciences about racism in literature outside of children's literature. So she talks about that. She mentions Willett's analysis of the social climate that surrounded proposed changes due to racial issues to rifles for Wadi, which is an article that I noticed as I was searching for this one, and that I would like to look into more, just because I think that it covers the question of racism in library books a little bit more in depth than this paper does. And then she talks about the bell curve, which is an infamous book now because it drew connections between intelligence and class with not only environment, but with genetic factors and with race, making the argument that certain racial groups were inferior in terms of intelligence and in terms of economic success due to their race. Something that, as I'm sure you know, has been very much refuted in subsequent literature. And she also mentions that very few books are censored or challenged due to racism, typically because that's obscured by other tags such as objectionable language. For instance, Huck Finn is usually challenged due to its use of the N-word and not for its racist themes. Okay, and then she moves outside of library and information studies, which I thought was a very smart move considering the newness of this profession and also all the in-depth research that has been done in the social sciences and in history and literature into racism. She does talk about hate speech here, and she defines hate speech for us, which I found incredibly useful, and it led me to reflect on her lack of a definition for racism, which I thought was kind of a weakness of this paper, considering racism is an often misunderstood term that has a variety of meanings and definitions, and we would have benefited the reader, who in this case is probably supposed to be the professional librarian, since that's who she aims her recommendations at. The professional librarian could benefit from a definition that was clearer. Anyways, we go into how some groups believe that even hate speech should be protected by our freedom of speech. and how other groups believe that minority groups are so hurt by this particular sort of hate speech and deeply affected by it that it should be banned. And I think that this is very interesting, and this is where a definition of racism could have helped us, because if we accept racism as sort of this institutionalized structural power system, then we can see how hate speech against whites is not going to have the same effect as hate speech against blacks. And I think that that's where those who support such a ban are coming from. She then goes into her summary and problem statement, which I highlighted here and put a little note saying problem statement, only because I can now refer back to this when I lose sight of what she's talking about, what her aims are. And I find it very useful that she so clearly outlined what the focus of the paper was, which is what are the general public's levels of social tolerance towards materials with racist content in public library collections. And from this, we truly understand that she's not only interested in what the scholars think, but how that compares to what the general public thinks. And she ultimately finds that the general public, the majority of the general public, based on the General Social Survey, do not believe that books should be removed based on racist content. This does vary according to education level. Those with more education are less likely to think books should be removed. Likewise, African Americans are more likely to advocate for the removal of books. And as we go along, Protestants are more likely to advocate for the removal of books than other religions. There is not much actually of a change over time. She does note, though, back up here in the limitations of the study, that there is not really a question of how we feel about racist depictions of groups other than African Americans. And there's not much of a follow-up in terms of how people acted. It's just more a question of their beliefs, and people may or may not act in accordance with those beliefs. So let's move down here. She goes into belief systems, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to hurry this up a little bit. And then she looks at occupations, and she notes, as we did when we looked at the graphs, that those working in the library and information studies are less likely than any other group to support the removal of racist books. Okay. Something interesting that I noted was that fundamentalist groups, people who are moral traditionalists, who attend church, also the elderly, people with less education, etc., are more likely to support the banning of such books that include racist materials. To me, however, such groups are also more likely to be racist. So I find that sort of paradox to be very intriguing, and I would love to learn more about it and maybe read the study that she quotes here, Tamny and Johnson, which they did in the fall of 1993, interviewing about 500 people. Okay, so then we go into our discussion. She basically reflects on what was shown in the data analysis, and actually this is where she references Tamny and Johnson. She does show that public opinion has changed somewhat over time, more so in terms of books talking about homophobic issues and books talking about communism than books talking about racism. And she says that this is because racism is perceived as a different type of social threat than homosexuality or communism. Racism limits the civil liberties of groups of people. So people believe that due to increasing tolerance, more people believe that such books should not be removed. And then finally, she goes into implications for future research and for professionals, talking about how being knowledgeable about these issues surrounding materials can help librarians stand by their professional values and educate the public about the implications of removing and not removing such items. And I think here she shows her true colors, which is that she believes that such books should not be removed, that in general, intellectual freedom is the standard by which everything should be done in libraries, and that more knowledge about such issues can help us apply those standards and help us to explain them to others. So overall, I thought this was a good article. I thought it was a little weak in terms of its literature review and in terms of its exploration of racism, but I do think that the General Social Survey is very helpful, and I'm glad that she examined it and sort of point out some of the major trends that it found. So thank you.